we were at NASA, I had the opportunity to work with Google on a project called Google Earth, which turned into Google Moon and Google Mars, and with Microsoft on a project called Worldwide Telescope. And while doing that, I realized that the way Google and Microsoft built infrastructure were very different than the way NASA built infrastructure. And it would probably benefit NASA, given the amount of data that we were beginning to generate, that we could use a similar approach to Google in our infrastructure. A team of folks, many of them are here at Nebula, really quickly, over the course of a few weekends, pulled together a brand new cloud engine that was very similar to Amazon, but was something we could run, and they open sourced it. And Openstack emerged literally only a few months later when Rackspace, which was one of the largest hosting companies, found that open source code and approached us and said, hey, we'd like to open source a lot of our stuff. And NASA has this thing that they've just open sourced that would perfectly complement the thing that we've just built. And we can put this together and we'll have compute and storage all in one project. And very rapidly, it seemed like everybody liked that idea. So it wasn't just NASA and Rackspace, but pretty early on, IBM started talking to us, and Red Hat, and a lot of big companies liked the idea that there was an open source ecosystem around cloud computing. So many people have bought into this idea that OpenStack has now become the fastest growing open source project in history. And within just 2 years, we have companies like IBM and AT&T and Red Hat, and even Microsoft has a team working on OpenStack. So it's probably one of the most successful open source projects in history. At this point, only a few years. OpenStack's been downloaded over 300,000 times since the beginning of the year. So there's a lot of people out there downloading it and using it. I'd be very surprised if most of the Fortune 1000 companies out there today don't have people experimenting with it. And if there's 300,000 other, that means a lot of small businesses, a lot of people building startups, a lot of people that are using Amazon Web Services that get a bill every month. You know, they're building some internet company, and that bill comes in, and they're starting to spend $1,000 a month, $5,000 a month, $50,000 a month. The really successful internet companies, like Zynga, for example, the bill that they get from Amazon Web Services starts to become very meaningful, and they start to figure out how are we gonna buy what we know we're gonna use. It's like living in a hotel, right? I mean, it's a very expensive way to do it if you know you're gonna need a place to come home to every day. So people tend to try to buy the base that their application uses, and then they rent the unpredictable spikes in demand. The best example I've ever heard for this was Domino's Pizza during Super Bowl. You know, if Domino's were to build the infrastructure required to take all the orders that they get during the Super Bowl, they would operate 5 times more infrastructure, or even 10 times more infrastructure, I forgot the exact number, than they would normally need. And so by using Amazon Web Services for that spike, and then they operate their own infrastructure for that normal load that they get, it's a very efficient way to build a business. As you look at the big internet companies, the innovation that they've done over the past few years have really been systems innovations. So when Facebook, for example, builds their data centers, and they've open sourced the designs of these data centers, which is kind of interesting. They're doing really innovative things with how they cool servers and what they're doing to power the servers. And they've benefited from a lot of open source technologies, and they've also given back. And I think that's another trend as companies are built. You know, if you use Spotify and you look at the about, you'll find a list of open source projects that's probably longer than the list of authors of that software. And that's true of most every really popular internet site, from Pinterest and to how many are there these days? I mean, there's so many. But I think if you look at all of these sites, almost all of them would not exist if there weren't a half a dozen open source projects that they started building on. And a lot of these companies just naturally give back to these projects because by making these projects better and more successful, it allows them to focus on all the cool stuff they're doing with their site and not on the underlying technology that helps power it. And OpenStack is just at the very foundation of all of these infrastructure technologies. So it affects everyone. this rising tide of innovation has really floated all the ships. And I think 25 years ago, 30 years ago, if I was a hobbyist, maybe I had access to a Commodore 64 or an Amiga or one of the first DOS systems or an early Mac, and it only did so much. Right? I only had so much capability on that. But now, a student in high school or college literally could build a Facebook internet site, by using a few taps on the keyboard to fire up hundreds or thousands of servers. I didn't have that when I was a kid. You're by default standing on the shoulders of giants because the accessibility from the cloud and the accessibility from these open source projects has enabled developers to literally build on this foundation. In the next 5 or 10 years, when you're at work and you need a piece of software to solve a problem, it'll be just as easy for you to get the software and the technology you need to solve a problem as it is to download a game on your iPhone. And the missing ingredient there is we need to make it as easy to install big enterprise applications on enterprise infrastructure as it is to install games and music and stuff on a phone.